Hello, and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. In central Pennsylvania, there's a large river watershed that follows the path of a large river that feeds the Susquehanna, as well as is fed by a creek that was turned into the largest lake of Pennsylvania at 8,300 acres, and several well-known creeks that are not called rivers based solely on their lack of interconnecting tributaries, like the Tuscarora, the Alwick, and a smaller version of the namesake, the Little Juniata. So yeah, the river is called the Juniata and is really long and pretty deep at most parts. But the question I am here for today is, how did this river get its name? Well, it may surprise you to know that it's named after a sacred and very tall, skinny rock that was put up in place by multiple tribes that existed long before the Pennsylvania Iroquois Nation was formed in the 1650s, and long before Pennsylvania natives became the Six Nation Confederacy in the 1720s. This sacred rock is known as the Standing Stone. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage. And if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. This channel, like all the other channels on YouTube, can only continue with the assistance of the viewer. The simple act of clicking like and subscribing informs YouTube that this is something you enjoy watching and would like to see more of. So in order to continue providing these videos of odd-to-see locations and stories of who we once were, I really need those likes and I really need those subscriptions. Now, let's get some things out of the way with this story that came up almost immediately and gave me pause before telling it. First, we're using a lot of Native American words and names from different tribes that have not existed for hundreds of years with a potential of up to tens of thousands of years. This is important because languages typically change when in isolation every 1,000 to 3,000 years, becoming incomprehensible to the more modern inhabitants who were born of and evolved through time at that same location. I identify this because we will see directly that we have different words that match the life origin of the Standing Stone. Now, I also mentioned up to tens of thousands of years, and I will address that later because someone's going to argue that man has only been in North America continent for 11,000 years since the time of the Bering Strait Land Bridge. But the reality of the Bering Strait Land Bridge, or as it's actually called, Beringia, was able to be traversed for nearly 2.6 million years, with a time period where we know man was actually stuck on it for as long as 11,000 years between glacial formations to the east and the west. Okay, back to the information that is not as old as dirt. Tribes of Native Americans in the United States are often put into two main categories, Clovis and pre-Clovis. The Clovis culture is defined by the common use of a leaf-shaped stone spearhead, which dates back to 11,500 years ago. And that's about the time the Wisconsin glacial melt was low enough that the natives were able to work their way down into North America and then further down towards South America. The pre-Clovis are defined by those who came over before the Wisconsin glacial period was large enough to stop man from getting into North America, which would be 20 to 30,000 years ago. In those time periods, even if all of the natives were of the same family and lineage, their language and culture would have changed completely about 30 times, to a point where one people would have never been able to understand the former people or their ways, especially based on language. And that Bering Land Bridge you were taught about in school, well, it was not just a little piece of marshy land and mud that you could barely cross, and only when the tide was out. The reality is, the landmass that formed around the Bering Strait before it fully froze was over 620 miles wide at its shortest point. And as long as British Columbia and Alberta together, at 620,000 square miles, just a hair under the total size of Alaska, which is a really big state. Now, back to Pennsylvania and this river named after a stone. The proper pronunciation of this river is Juniata, not any other way, regardless of what you may have heard or read. The origin and original name is possibly unknown, but what we do know is that it originates in our modern history from a tribe of natives known as the Uniuatahaga, a name which means vertical stone of the local inhabitants. They called the river ODDDySEEy. The first reference to this river and this tribe is actually found on a Dutch exploration map from 1655, where they called the river by the name Uniuata, based on the name of the inhabitants, which was common practice for naming areas, rivers, mountains, and valleys during that time. Let us address the Uniuatahaga river name of ODDDySEEy. ODDDySEEy is the name given to the Juniata River by the ODDDySEEy natives who form a subset of the Susquehannocks, or as we call them now, the Susquehannock town or tribe, possibly as far back as 1608. In this particular instance, please feel free to leave a comment and give me correction on the use of the word town or tribe. From what I've found in both scholastic and native circles, there does not seem to be a 100% agreement on what constitutes a tribe in size, nor a town in size when referring to Native Americans. For example, the Six Nations were referred to as a nation or a confederacy, and also as a league. But in all three situations, it does not change the base meaning of multiple tribes. It's supposed to define a size or a conglomerate, and it's not exactly clear what the meanings are. At this time, the Susquehannock were a group of pre-Iroquois tribes in Pennsylvania that consisted of 6 towns called the Susquehanna, the Quadrico, the Adak, the Tessene, I believe it's Tessene, the Uchawig, and the Sapawig. And if I said any of those wrongs, please give me the phonetic down below, especially if you are one of those tribes, and I apologize. No insults are intended here. All of these tribes lived in close proximity of the Massawallanekis, known to be a formidable enemy to the other tribes' way of life. These are all tribal groups recorded by Captain John Smith during his exploration. The downside is the part where the Massawallanekis were described as formidable enemies. All conclusions Captain John Smith had made about all of the natives he had encountered were specific to those whom had a quarters for what he referred to as a king, which may or may not have been a chief, but most definitely was someone who was considered a higher, more important, stronger, or elder to the tribe. Likewise, all of his naming conventions and calculations were based on the concept that the natives posed a real and present danger or threat to the crown. Back to the sub-branch of the Susquehanna natives, the ODDDySEEy. We don't know much about them, other than being part of the 5 nations of Susquehannock and the namesake for the Juniata River, all the way up to and including the area where the Uniuatahaga lived. Now, here's where things get interesting. As we learned earlier, the Uniuatahaga were the people of the projecting rock or standing stone, and the Dutch called the ODDDySEEy River the Uniuata. Thus, the river became pronounced as the modern Juniata, in lieu of the Uniata. But their name meant projecting rock or standing stone, depending on if you were using the Mohawk or ODDySEEy translation, which would correspond to the ODDDySEEy river name, and as described by Captain John Smith, hellish and guttural throat language where they would open their mouths and not use their lips to speak. Why? Well, like lots of other native tribes, their names were derived from all sorts of aspects that they may have been representative of. Like the Tuscarora, whose name meant people of the hemp, and individually they were just the Skarura tribe. but people of the hemp were named after their manner of fastening the hemp garnered from the milkweed into making clothing similar to modern cotton. Let me know in the comments below if you know of stories and locations such as this one, the Standing Stone. My research is limited only by the information that people don't share openly. Help me break that barrier and let's share the history and culture of who we once were. Very close to the Uniuata were the Uniuaya tribe, whose name meant upright stone, and they lived along what is now called the Stone Creek, which is a tributary of the Juniata River. The symbol they used for their area was a long stone stuck upright into the fork of a younger growing tree. This marked their entryways and gateways to their actual tribal areas. Their name, Uniuaya, evolved into Oneida, as the Uniuata evolved into Juniata. And these Uniuaya were not the same as the Oneida found in the Iroquois Nation near upstate New York. So now we have two tribes living in essentially the same area, both with a name regarding a stone that stands upright with two disparate languages. And there's a reason for this. As it would turn out, this area was considered a sacred area along a couple of confluences that existed much in the middle of the extremely difficult Kittanning Path. It was and still is an area where multiple mountain ranges all interconnect and provide the only north, south, east, and west passages with the Allegheny Mountain Range. So it would have been a very well-known location by many tribes of Indians whom traveled in any direction that required crossing from the Ohio Valley anywhere eastward. So sacred as to there having been a stone that once stood here representing that fact. This stone was first recorded by Conrad Weiser and later by Peter Shaver, another renowned Indian trader who settled in this area, and I talk about it in my first video ever made for the channel, the McGuire Massacre Cemetery. Just a few years after Conrad Weiser documented the Standing Stone, John Harris also recorded a stone that stood 14 feet tall and 6 inches square with the names of many tribes written all over this stone in their respective languages, and it existed where the Juniata River met with the Standing Stone Creek. So, what do we know about the Standing Stone? Well, aside from the fact that it was there, and that not only did the local tribe share its name, but it was considered sacred and had the names of many different tribes carved into it. And unfortunately, that's all we know. 1754 was the year John Harris made his recording, and about the same time, the colonists started moving out into this area in much larger numbers. Stepping backward 100 years to 1640, the Uniuata may have been integrating with the Lenape. Regardless, all the tribes had been conquered by the Iroquois and placed into a forced integration process which was now coming through this area. 1754 also happens to be the last time this stone, the Uniuata or the Uniuaya, were ever seen or heard from again. It's not known if the stone was destroyed, buried, sunk in the river, or just plain moved, or where those tribes chose to relocate to, or if they too were destroyed, buried, or sunk into the river. The prevailing theory is that they relocated further west and took the stone with them. But there's nothing corroborating the disappearance of that or of the stone with relocation, nor is there any record of integration into the Lenape, the Shawnee, the Ohio Valley, or northern Iroquois tribes, nor anything of a battle that rages and decimated these tribes. On this one, we honestly got nothing. In researching further west, I had hoped that something might come up about a standing stone or tribe with similar names, and the closest I could find is that of Devil's Tea Table, or some other Native American named natural stone feature that exists really close or in waterways, but nothing of a man-made monolith of 14 feet and 6 inches square with tribal writings from many different tribes or nations, or with any sacred meaning. Not even the ones in West Virginia or Tennessee have any connection back to what once was here in the valley at the river confluences. What does exist is the river still carries the name Juniata. The creek is still Stone Creek. The name Juniata is part of a college, a town, and many other locations in the area, as well as the name Oneida as a township where the Oniuaya may very well have been located. Even though we lack a proper record surrounding the standing stone, it must have been talked about at great lengths amongst the colonists and explorers, because by the time 1768 rolled around and this area was being heavily settled post the 1765 walking purchase execution for this entire territory, local surveyors such as John Lukens in 1768, as well as Charles Lukens and Thomas Smith, raised a stone of similar dimensions bearing the names of the founders and surveyors. In 1805, the founder of Huntingdon, Dr. William Smith, had built a house on the property where the stone resided and had it moved to his backyard. In 1815, he moved to a larger residence across the street, and at some time shortly thereafter, the stone was, for reasons and by unknown entities, destroyed. A piece of the second stone exists in the Huntingdon County Courthouse in a display case at the main lobby. A third stone was erected during the Huntingdon Borough Centennial in September of 1896. This stone stands to this day. The dedication was given by J. Simpson Africa, a man who played a large role in the history, surveying, engineering, and the evolutions of government in Huntingdon, as well as the United States. It was his research that put together their original puzzle of the native words Juniata and Oneida, both having an origin of standing stone. Earlier I mentioned up to tens of thousands of years. Well, that is because these Native American tribes existed in this area definitively 12,000 years ago, which is longer than the believed 11,000 years ago when the migration just started out of Beringia, or the Bering Land Bridge area. This means that if we know definitively that man was already here before the perceived 11,000 year thaw of Beringia, then it's also quite possible that these tribes that lived individually may have been around long before the Iroquois nation began its conquering escapade across the eastern seaboard. As for the reality of this postulate, I'm sure a lot of you are shaking your head saying there was no way for a man to have inhabited this area earlier than 11,000 years ago. Which brings up the subject of one of our future site visits to the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Washington County, Pennsylvania, with remnants of man more than 16,000 years old, and even the conspirator subject of the cave found under Sheep Rock Shelter, with the excavation of the even older site and over 80,000 retrieved artifacts that got cut short in order to flood the valley for the Racetown Dam, resealing all of that history in that site in a never-to-be-seen-again watery grave that has become the most visited cliff used to jump into the lake during the summer months. I hope you enjoyed learning about this odd-looking standing stone in Huntingdon County. If you haven't already, remember to click like on this video and to subscribe for more ODDySEEy stories of who we once were. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.